Welcome to the class tonight, and we're going to do a short review of our Plant Lab Part 1. Our lab objectives for today are to outline plant evolution and phylogeny, discuss characteristics shared among members of the kingdom Plantae, review photosynthesis, examine non-vascular plants, and examine vascular seedless plants. I'm not going to read everything to you, but I do want to point out some key factors as I go through this review. When we look at plant evolution and phylogeny, the transition to life on land, 700 to 800 million years ago, green algae living near the edge of a pond or stream became the ancestors of what we know today as modern plants. Land plants and green algae share certain traits. The traits that they share include cellulose in cell walls, possess light-absorbing pigments, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, and the energy captured during photosynthesis is stored and is used to produce glucose, which is then stored as starch. Today, we recognize approximately 300,000 different species of plants, which are organized into 4 main classes or lineages that include non-vascular plants, vascular seed plants, vascular seed plants known as gymnosperms, and flowering plants known as angiosperms. Note, this first plant lab focuses on non-vascular and vascular seedless plants, which you probably already know if you did your pre-lab. And here are some examples. This non-vascular and vascular seed plants, and breaking that down to the gymnosperms and angiosperms, and their ancestral protists. So what are plants? We know that plants have many common characteristics. They're multicellular, they're photosynthetic eukaryotes. We know they have pigment chlorophyll and chlorophyll that's known as A and B contained inside those chloroplasts. The cell walls are made of cellulose. They have a waxy protective cuticle. They possess multicellular sex organs, and the life cycle is characterized by the alternation of generations. So these are some key things that I want you to remember as you're doing your lab, because you're thinking about those characteristics and what role they play in this plant lab. So let's elaborate. We know that the multicellular photosynthetic eukaryotes have chloroplasts. And here you see this equation, which is quite familiar. It's a balanced equation, and this equation we know that's connected to what? Photosynthesis. You are correct if you guessed that. Remember, there are 6 carbon dioxides with 6 waters. That's going to yield us a molecule of glucose and 6 oxygen. Most of our plants are photoautotrophs, and the primary producers that carry out photosynthesis using what type of energy? Solar energy. Carbon dioxide, water, and dissolved minerals to manufacture their own food. Together with photosynthetic bacteria and protists, plants supply the atmosphere with oxygen and provide nutritional foundation for nearly all communities of life, which include us. So right here, what is this a picture of? Which organelle is being represented here? Yes, chloroplast is the correct answer. We're showing the things that are occurring with inside of here. You have your light reactions that are happening in your Calvin cycle. Remember, when you think about the thylakoid, the grana, all of those are the components of our chloroplast. That light is coming in, and within this you have your water coming for your light reactions and yield out that oxygen, and you have your CO2 going through your Calvin cycle to yield out sugar. These, once again, are key factors to remember that give you the characteristic of plants. We know that cell walls are going to provide that support, contain pressure, and protect against invaders. Now, a primary cell wall is composed of cellulose fibers. The walls are adjacent and are held together by a layer of pectin, which forms in the middle lamella. So that cuticle is that outer waxy layer of film that covers an aerial portion of the plant. One example I always like to show my students is a magnolia leaf, because you can see that waxy layer. It's produced by the cells of the epidermis. It slows water loss and helps prevent the desiccation. And here are examples over here that are shown to you. Now, let's focus on the last two things. They possess multicellular sex organs, and they're discussed as specific plants which are covered in this lab. The plant life cycle demonstrates an alternation of generations. So members of this kingdom, they alternate between haploid and diploid forms. Within the haploid generation, one copy of each chromosome, which is represented by the letter N, while the diploid generation has two copies of each chromosome, which is represented by 2N. Remember, di means two, so that's where we're seeing the 2N. In this life cycle, an unfertilized haploid cell, which is a spore, grows into the multicellular haploid, the gametophyte, and the gametophyte produces the gametes, which we know are sperm in male and egg in a female, which fuse for fertilization to produce a diploid zygote. This eventually matures into a multicellular diploid sporophyte, which will later produce spores via the process of meiosis. So now that I talked about that, let's look at it. This right here is going to demonstrate the alternation of generations. If you look here, you see your spore, you see your sperm and your egg gametes, which are shown here. Of course, sperm and egg, they have to go through the process of fertilization to get the zygote, which is going to form the embryo of that sporophyte. Meiosis is a very important component in this life cycle. From there, what we talked about with the spore, we have the gametophyte. So haploid, remember, that's going to be 1. Diploid is 2. So this is an example of the plant life cycle. Please pay attention to this note here. One thing we want to make sure remember, that this is demonstrating the alternation of generations in the plant kingdom. Now, what we have established regarding plants, we know they evolved from an ancestral green algae. We've already, talked about the multicellular photosynthetic eukaryotes, the cellulose and waxy cuticle, the life cycle characterized by the alternation of generations, and that they're divided in 4 classes. So that's just a quick review of what we talked. Now, let's look at some of our non-vascular plants. Now, our most primitive and simple land plants. One thing I want you to remember is that they lack a vascular system for conducting water, and therefore, they like to live in a perpetually damp environment. They lack true roots, stems, leaves, and lignified cells. Pyraphytes do have undifferentiated body called a thallus and root-like structures called rhizoids. But remember, the dominant phase of the life cycle is a haploid gametophyte. Here's a life cycle of a moss. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but one thing I want you to look at is after meiosis, you see your buds and your rhizoids are here. Remember, the sporangium releases spores that are formed from meiosis, and each germinating spore forms, and that's going to help with the growth of that bud-like mass. We still have that haploid and diploid that's represented by yellow and a teal color here. Each bud is going to develop into a male gametophyte, and then the female or a female gametophyte. And from there, the flagellate sperm develop, eggs develop, and it goes through that process, of course, of fertilization and forms its zygote. Here are some importance of the bryophytes. Non-vascular land plants. Some are hornworts and harbor mutualistic nitrogen-fixing cyanobacteria. In Arctic tundras, the bryophytes constitute as much as half of the biomass. And we also have things like peat moss that are used for fuel in some places like Ireland. Here are some non-vascular plants like the liverwort and mosses that are shown here. And we also, when we focus on our seedless vascular plants, we remember that they produce sexually by releasing swimming sperm that require free water to reach the eggs. But unlike the bryophytes, their sporophyte generation separates from the gametophyte generation and has well-developed vascular tissue in the xylem and in the phylum. The diploid sporophyte in the larger, longer-lived stage of the life cycle, while the haploid gametophyte is very small and very short-lived. Examples are shown below. Here's another example of our seedless vascular plants, our ferns, which are vascular plants with xylem and phylum. The sporophyte generation has true roots, modified horizontal stems called the rhizomes, and fronds emerge from the nodes along the rhizome. This is a common plant that you're probably quite familiar with. Here's an example of a fern's anatomy. We just look at the general things. You have your stalk, your blade, and those two pieces together make up the frond. The rhizome is a cross-section. Vascular tissue is located centrally. We know that the xylem distributes water, and then the phylum distributes solutes, carbohydrates, and sucrose, which is a sugar. Now we have seedless vascular plants known as horsetails. One surviving genus that we see is approximately 15 different species. It grows in a moist soil along streams and in disturbed habitats. Most are less than 1 meter in height. Their sporophytes typically have an underground rhizomes along with the roots that anchor that to the soil. One last thing I want to point out here is that haploid spores are dispersed from the sporangia by the air currents. So they germinate, gametophyte, gametes, fertilization, and the diploid. Here's an example of some horsetails. Seedless vascular plants. Coal is a fossil fuel that we all know and familiar with. It's formed when dead plant matter is exposed to elevated temperatures and pressure over a long period of time. Our seedless vascular plants from approximately 1/4 billion years ago are those coal that we burn today. So why is this important? You don't have to answer it out loud, but just think about it. Why? What is the significance? And why do we continue to use this today? The carbon cycle. We know that plants are mainly carbon. Dead plants are mainly carbon. Coal is mainly carbon. When coal and other fossil fuels are burned for energy, much of the carbon quickly enters the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas that traps heat in the atmosphere and is something that's connected to what we know as global warming. So here's a cycle that's being shown over here where carbon is being released in the atmosphere when fossil fuels are being burned. I think I got cut off. It's when they're being burned. And it goes through this cycle and process. Remember, plants are part of this. Carbon is, of course, released back. It also goes with our fossil fuels are burned. Carbon is decaying matter and residues. Carbon also is stored in our soils. This wraps up our review. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them soon as this video is over. It should be a quick refresher for our lab. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's lab, and we're going to have a marvelous Monday here in class tonight. Thank you.